Since the early 1980s, the city has been trying to make sure that Boston residents, women, and people of color get a fair share of jobs on major development projects. Over the years, the policy has been applied in the shadow of legal challenges around the country, yet it was also revised and strengthened. But according to an investigative series by the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting, the policy is still falling short of its goals, with no formal sanctions on contractors. To tell us about his report is the investigations editor, Paul Singer. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I want to start with the background in this policy because people like the idea of a fair share of jobs for people who live in Boston, but at the same time, they might be wondering, since when does the city get to tell private developers or institutions who they can hire on the construction project? I mean, what's the dynamic behind that?
It's been going on for decades. Again, as you mentioned, the original version of this ordinance was back in 1983. And the whole concept is, look, the city is, some of these are city-funded projects, obviously, it's sort of easier to see the connection there. But the ones that are private projects, they're still asking stuff of the city, like waivers, variances from zoning. There may be some other sort of incentives or assistance the city's providing. So what the city has said to the private builders as well as the public builder, the government sort of projects is, you have to include city residents on those jobs. City residents, women, and people of color should be getting a paycheck because you are getting a service from the city of Boston. And we'll talk more about it. The legal footing of those requirements has turned out to be extraordinarily shaky.
Yes, explain the shakiness, because I think this has been almost challenged as a kind of reverse discrimination, right?
Yeah, well, what the original lawsuits, a bunch of cities had these policies in the 80s and 90s, and the lawsuits basically turned on this question of you're discriminating against people from out of state or out of the community. Why is it that Boston should have a right to say that a person from Worcester can't come into Boston and do that job? And they couldn't really prove, the cities couldn't prove that the influx of the person from Worcester is taking a job away from a person in Boston. They couldn't create a direct link. And so the courts basically threw all of these policies out around the country and said, you can't prove that this limitation is addressing a specific problem that these other workers are causing for your city's employment.
Well, certainly one thing we've heard repeatedly over the years, mainly from contractors, I would imagine, is that we don't have enough people of color who are qualified to do the job right away. We don't have enough women who can do the job right away. What about that?
This is the magic question, because we've been doing this series for a year on government contracts, on, we just did a story about the Steamship Authority not hiring any Black companies for their work. And we get the same answer every time, is that the companies aren't out there, the Black workers aren't out there, the women workers aren't out there. And at some point you have to ask this question, well, why is that? Like, what is there institutionally that is preventing Black companies from growing up to be able to take these jobs, from minority workers being able to be trained in these trades? Are the unions doing enough to bring them all, include them in the union roles? I don't know the answer to these questions. I really don't. But there is something I think fundamentally to ask, that if we've been having the same conversation for 20 years, that there's not enough of those workers out there, why hasn't that changed in 20 years? What are we doing wrong? And maybe what we're doing wrong is we're not truly including them in the process to allow them to grow into these jobs.
Well, one project that you look at, and this is a project that's in progress right now, I think at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital or Medical Center, there is a city official who's in charge of implementing a policy. He has a problem with that project. Tell me a little about the problem and how much the city has tried to do about it.
It's really interesting because it gets to the heart of this ordinance. The ordinance says you must hire 51% Boston residents, 40% people of color, and 12% women. And this particular project, the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, it's a lot of words, is about a year underway, and they haven't come anywhere near those targets. And several of the subcontractors who are working on that job have been in the 10 and 12 and 15% range. So the Boston Employment Commission has the authority to call them on the carpet and say, you are not meeting your targets, right? Why are you not meeting your targets? Sooner or later, the Employment Commission has been getting agitated about this for quite a while. They finally just said, we're going to sanction them. And that's where we begin to discover that they don't actually have the power to sanction anybody. All they can really do is bring them in and wag their finger. Now, Beth Israel and the prime contractor, Turner Construction, said they're very eager to meet these goals. They're trying to find the workers. They plan, as the project ramps up over the next year, to bring on more workers of color, more women, more local residents. But ultimately, what our story is about is that the city essentially told this commission that's supposed to be enforcing this policy, we can't actually really enforce it. Sorry.
Of course, one of the other things I've heard over the years from some of the community advocates for this kind of inclusion is that there really are people out there who are qualified and pretty much ready. So what about that argument too?
Well, part of what goes on at the Boston Employment Commission is a kind of matchmaking progress where you come in and you're going to, Lovett Construction is going to build this building. You show up at the commission hearing and say, look, here are our numbers, they're not meeting the goals. In theory, the Boston Employment Commission has the ability to say, oh, well, we have connections with the plumbers union over here. Go talk to them and they'll arrange. And oh, yes, we do have some workers of color or some Boston residents. And it's supposed to be a bit of a matchmaking environment where you can find the workers. But again, the question comes down to, I hear the same things that you hear from some of these community leaders, say the workers are absolutely available. So my question is, what is the hurdle preventing those workers from getting employed on those jobs? I don't know the answer to that question, but it seems clear that there is some disconnect between the community saying, we have people who can take the jobs, and contractors saying, well, we went looking but couldn't find them. So one of our future stories in this process is going to be, where is that disconnect and what's really happening that's preventing that connection from happening?
Well, one of the things you've been doing in this series is you've been looking at other cities and what's done by other agencies, even locally. Look at Massport, for example, and I know they might have a different kind of leverage because they might be intervening at a different stage of a project, but what does that say about the possibilities, at least?
Well, it's interesting. Massport has this model that they've been testing out. I will say, for what it's worth, we've only seen a couple of success stories in that model itself, but it's an interesting model. What they are trying to do is, in government contracts, generally, it's a sort of low bid situation. If you're cheapest, you win. What Massport is trying to do is create a ranking system for people bidding on government contracts that includes, you have to come to the table with a minority contractor who is part of the bid, who is a partner in the project, not a subcontractor who might get dollars later, but somebody who really comes as part of the startup of this project. And your ability to include a minority contractor at that level, at that beginning stages of the bid, gives you an upper hand in the bidding process. So part of the conversation becomes, are there ways, and is this a model for ways that we can start to take apart the public contracting system to allow for inclusion of things other than just low bid? Because if you're looking for just low bid on whatever object this is, the biggest national company is probably going to make this object cheaper than a local minority small business is going to make it. So it's a really interesting conversation about where the taxpayer's interest is. Is it getting this cheapest or getting it made by a local and possibly minority owned company?
Of course, the other thing going on, I think, under Massport is that the capacity of contractors gets built up as well. It's not just like saying this is the contractor and they're at this one stage.
That's right. That's right. And honestly, this is where we get to the conversation, Chris, about the difference between a paycheck and building wealth. Is that it's one thing to hire people and say, well, we have minority workers on the job. It's another thing to be hiring minority-owned companies that is building wealth in the minority community for generations to pass on.
Of course, the other thing is there's a bigger picture here. This is not just about construction projects and who does that work. You're looking at the ways that public money goes to different places. Contractors, for example, you've also looked at how much of the city contracting money goes to companies headed by women or people of color. I heard it was really, really low. Then I heard a slightly higher figure. What do you see going on there?
Well, for the contracts, there's a complicated version of the story on government contracts in Massachusetts. And the short version is this: government agencies have been incentivized to inflate the numbers so that it looks like they are achieving significant success when in fact they're not. So when the governor of Massachusetts issues a report saying we spent $411 million with minority businesses last year, it's just not really true. They're counting several categories of things that are not actually contracts to minority businesses. They're counting prime contractors to the state donating to minority nonprofits, which is fine. If you want to count that as part of the economic impact of the state's involvement in government contracting, whatever, okay. But the way they're doing it, they make it look like, oh, look, we're having annual growth of an extraordinary number, but it's just not true. That's one of the things we are really digging into with the state, is that the way they are reporting their numbers on government contracting minorities, they are, I would argue, artificially inflating their results because they are trying to show success in their program, not achieve progress in making sure that minorities are fully included in the process.
Finally, Paul, I know there is more to come on these stories, and you've got a whole team working on them. So if people want to keep track of that, what's the best way for them to find it, especially going online?
Yeah, if you just Google WGBH Color of Public Money, the series is called The Color of Public Money, and we've put a little landing page where all the stories are there. So come on, and you can also, if you have suggestions or ideas, you can reach out to us at investigations@wgbh.org. That's our investigative hotline email. We're glad to hear from folks on this topic.
Well, thank you very much.
Topic.
All right, and thank you very much for sharing us and getting us engaged. It was Paul Singer from the GBH Center for Investigative Reporting. And we'll
Thanks very much for inviting
news
us on. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. We'll have more news in just a moment.